he wouldn't tell you that that was your diagnosis. What does that diagnosis connect?
One of the reasons I did my book is to give hope to people, because I think the diagnosis can feel like a sentence to a bleak and painful life. And it doesn't have to be that way if people get, appropriate care and support and so on.
So it's not a death sentence?
It's not a death sentence.
What is it?
What is it? It's a struggle. I see someone 5 days a week. I mean, I'm a big therapy user. Having gone through psychoanalytic training, I know analysis is supposed to end, but I'm a lifer.
You're a lifer. It's what keeps you well. It sounds like your connection with your therapist.
That's a big part of it, yeah.
And what is your life like now?
I have a great life. I have a job that is wonderful, very kind, very accommodating, very collegial faculty, caring faculty. I love work. I say my mind's my best friend and my worst enemy, because if I can focus on an argument or a paper or an idea, a lot of times it can make some of the bad stuff recede to the sidelines. So it really is a very big help to me. So I love work. I have a wonderful husband whom I love and who loves me, great friends. Freud said what people want is to love and to work, and people with schizophrenia want that as much as everyone else, and I feel like I have it. I can't imagine in a way a better life.
Why do you think there's so many people diagnosed with schizophrenia that are not working, that do not have a marriage?
I'm not like a lone woman who did it through sheer force of will. It was a lot of treatment.
I see.
So that's one thing. Another thing is I think mental health professionals harbor some fantasies about or stigmas about schizophrenia that aren't quite right, like that you're not going to be able to work and you're not going to be able to have relationships, and people enact self-fulfilling prophecies. I wrote a little article in Psych Services about it, accommodations in higher education. I wrote a response, a commentary on it. And I said, higher education is really important because if you get the degrees, you can get it's kind of a ticket to a better job and a better life. And I said, figuring out what to tell people who are newly diagnosed, I think people should aim high. I don't think people should be told right away, lower your expectations. And it's also the case that something that looks like aiming high may not be aiming high. And the example I gave when I was being readmitted to Yale, I had to be interviewed by the head psychiatrist. And he suggested that I take a year and work as a cashier at a food store. Wow. And I thought to myself, I've been a student all my life. I'm very good at being a student. I know how to do it. It's a very flexible job, so to speak. Standing behind a cash register with people demanding change would have driven me nuts. So being a student was actually much less stressful for me than would have been to take a menial job. But I think a lot of time people give up too soon. It's sort of like, well, you have this, you're never going to be able to do work. So just do something minimal. Go to a sheltered workshop. Go to a clubhouse. And I think that we should, empower people to try to fulfill their potential. I'm not saying everyone can be a doctor or a psychologist or a lawyer, but I think most people can live up to their premorbid potential if they're given the right resources and if they don't give up. And we should not encourage people to give up. Probably the best way to counteract stigma is for people to come forward and tell their stories and say that they refuse to be defined the way you wanted to define me, kind of thing.
You talked about seclusion and restraints, and I know that you've had personal experiences with seclusion and restraints, and then you've also done research on seclusion and restraints. Do both the outcomes of your experience and the outcomes of your research compare well?
Well, I'm just starting the research. The experience, I wrote my law school note on restraints, and it was a chapter of my book on refusing care. Okay. But I'm just about to start doing literal empirical research. But I think restraints are extremely problematic. Being restrained is degrading, humiliating, causes feelings of helplessness, and over about 10 hours, enormous pain. Your limbs just ache from being unable to move. I had nightmares for years and years afterwards. I was restrained for such long periods of time. When I did my research, and this was back in the mid-'80s, a lot of doctors wrote articles saying restraints are a treatment. They make patients feel safer. But when you talk to patients and listen to them in restraints begging to be released, and when you read reviews having patients rank emergency measures, patients don't like restraints. It's just maybe make doctors feel better to think that they do, but they don't. The other thing that they say is, well, whether it makes patients feel safe, it keeps them safer. On the other hand, there was a series in the Hartford Courant, and they solicited the input of a Harvard statistician based on the data that they collected. And he determined that every week in this country, 1 to 3 people die in restraints. They aspirate their vomit, they have a heart attack, they strangle. Are we saving lives by using restraints, or are we losing lives by using restraints? Mm-hmm. So if I were the czar writing the law on restraints, I would have a many-fold approach. I would limit its use to where it's really necessary, such as in transportation, or if the doctor or nurse needs to be interviewing you at close hand. I would procedurally burden it, so I would make it so that a doctor has to check every half hour, every hour. You have to let the person out every 2 hours and see how they do, et cetera, et cetera. There is evidence that if you procedurally burden it, it's used less in New York, for instance. I would change the liability regime. I would make it so that a doctor who didn't restrain and someone got hurt would only be liable if he or she were grossly negligent. Conversely, if you were restrained, even if you didn't suffer physical injury, you could get more than, quote, dignitary damages, which usually aren't enough to encourage a lawyer to take your case. Mm-hmm. So I would change the liability regime, and I would rule out, just plain out rule out, tying someone's spread eagle to a bed. I think it's just too compromising. I've never been sexually abused, but I imagine people who have would find that really, really painful. So those are some of the kind of steps I would take. But I'm starting a think tank here at USC on law, mental health, and ethics, and I think our first issue, or one of our first issues, is going to be restraints. And I hope to work together with you on studying this and figuring out what best to do.
Very exciting to do so. I know they don't use restraints in the United Kingdom.
Right.
How can they not use them there and yet still use them here? I don't understand. What do they do there?
Well, I asked, what do you do? And I actually have a little experience of it. When I was volunteering in a hospital my last year of Oxford, after I had been hospitalized several years earlier, at one point this young man jumped another young man and started screaming and hitting him. And staff and patient pulled him off and brought him to another side of the ward and sat him down and sat with him. And a doctor came and said, John, that just wasn't on. You can't do that anymore. And that was it. In America, he would have been restrained for days or hours or days or whatever. So, but I asked people, when someone gets out of control, what do? They said, well, we physically hold them, but usually after 5 or 10 minutes, and we give them medication. Usually after 5 or 10 minutes, they calm down, and if they don't, we put them in seclusion, but we don't tie them to a bed. Okay. And it works.
So that sounds like, again, it has to do with the connection that a doctor is making with the patient.
That's a very good observation. I think that it's easiest to help people manage when you have that connection, and when they trust you as someone who cares about them and is benign and looking out for you.
Do you think our society in the United States tolerates differences well?
No. I mean, it's sort of interesting. People ask me about England versus America. When I was in England, it was sort of less open to mental illness, and even just going to see a therapist was like, oh my God, you must have something really wrong with you. On the other hand, they're much more tolerant of eccentricity. All those Oxford dons, with their wild hair and this and that. So I think here we're more open to therapy. I don't know too many people who've never been in therapy. At the same time, we're less tolerant of people being different, I think. There's sort of more toe the party line type thing.
And more specific.
I feel. Yeah.
And what would you say to somebody who is in the public who's either experiencing difficulties in terms of getting help, or if they're having a family member experience difficulties? What can you say?
I would say don't be ashamed and get treatment, because it's treatable, and there is help.
There is help.
Yeah. I mean, if I would tell someone who is starting to develop symptoms or has symptoms, to approach it from multiple angles, I would suggest that they get a good therapist that they can trust and that they can call in difficult times, that if they need medication, they stay on medication, that they recruit friends and family to help. My husband and my best friend Steve can sometimes tell when I'm slipping before I can. Will says I am a particular kind of quiet, not just quiet, but a particular kind.
Wow.
Find a place, a work or a job or an activity that you really enjoy. Some people like to work, some people like to be with people. Do something that you like and that gives your life meaning. And accept if you've got a mental illness, it's not so terrible. Try to accept it and kind of move on. My husband says psychosis is not like an on-off switch, but like a dimmer. You know, and at the far end, I'll have a transient thought and I'll immediately dismiss it. Oh, that's just my illness acting up. Okay. That happens several times a day. A little bit further on, I may have 2 or 3 days if I'm under stress where I'm getting symptomatic. And at the far end, I would be, you know, crouched in a corner shaking. That hasn't happened in 10 years. Wow. So it varies depending on what kind of stress I'm under.
And during the time that you're experiencing the symptom, you wouldn't say, I'm experiencing a symptom.
Well, no,
That's
at the far end I do. When I have the transient thought, I'll say, oh, Elyn, that's just your illness acting up. Pay that thought no mind.
I see.
And then, then there are degrees of insight. You know, I almost always have insight that my thoughts and feelings and ideas would appear crazy to people. Okay. And I'm motivated not to appear crazy, so I don't say them out loud, or I leave if I can't not say them out loud. So I always have social judgment. But in terms of understanding that I'm actually having an illness, there are times that I don't. I mean, again, I'll say, I know people think I have it, but I don't. I just have a special premium on the truth. I know blah, blah, blah. So.
Well, I do think you have a special premium on the truth.
I wish.
What would a clinician see if they were evaluating you on your very worst day?
I look like a floridly psychotic street person.
What would that look like?
Disheveled, in and out of kind of being in the world, you know, more autistic, less autistic, confused thoughts, fear, really emotional lability, fear to hysteria to anger or whatever, mostly fear though. I would just look like, you know, actually, I was actually having lunch with some famous people, and there was a psychiatrist there, and he was telling them that, you know, Elyn does not have a mild psychotic illness. She gets as sick as you can get, but she also has a lot of resources and is as better as you can get in those other moments. So
I guess the trick would be for a clinician to keep in mind you now, or another person,
right,
being very, very well and healed and being successful at what they love to do, like you are, right, even on their worst day.
My analyst in New Haven contacted my first analyst here in LA, and he told him, which I thought was really good advice, don't be too scared of her, which I thought was really, really an important thing to say. And I've been lucky. I've had analysts sit with considerable anxiety and fear about my dangerousness or whatever for the sake of respecting my wishes not to be hospitalized. Wow. They didn't have to do that, but they did, and I consider that great act of generosity.
What do you mean exactly? Can you talk about that some more?
Well, no. When I was decompensated, when I was feeling violent things and crazy and out of control and so on, and they'd say, you know, I think you really need to be in the hospital, and I'd say I don't want to, and they'd say, okay, we're going to try to work with this. Let's speak twice a day or come in twice, whatever. Do something else.
See, and because your experiences in the hospital were so horrific,
correct,
that you didn't want to go, and it would be a breach of trust if
yes,
your therapist would have hospitalized
exactly,
you. So they really needed to sit with that you seem dangerous, but that you were going to be okay.
Exactly.
And you were.
Yep.
Can you talk about your book a little, The Center Cannot Hold?
I guess I describe my journey with schizophrenia. I talk about my childhood. I talk about my first episodes. Sort of running through or my relationships and my work. So it's sort of my illness, behavior and history, my relationships, my work, what's helped. I think the thing I'm most proud of about the book is sort of giving a window inside the mind of someone acutely out of touch with reality so that people will understand, and the hope is if they understand, they'll be less frightened and less angry, and stigma will go down. So that's the hope.
And it's on the New York Times bestseller list.
It was, yeah.
Well, the County of Los Angeles Department of Mental Health thanks you so much. We consider you to be a wonderful person.
Oh, thank you.
We're so delighted.
Thank you. I'm really glad you're doing this, and I hope it helps people feel better and safer about, you know, exploring their own issues and getting care.
Yes. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Los Angeles loves you.
Thanks.